You sit before me, and even if you do not speak, I can feel the subtle trembling of an inner truth preparing to break the surface. There is a peculiar silence around those who have suffered too deeply, a silence not born from peace, but from intensity, as if the psyche has spent years holding itself together with sheer instinct and suddenly senses that the time for survival is ending. You call yourself an empath, and indeed, you feel the world with a permeability that often seems unbearable. But what you do not yet realize is that this very sensitivity has been preparing you for a return, rising, a comeback of such magnitude that even your own pain could not predict it. The unconscious has a strange way of orchestrating these turning points. It allows you to collapse only to make space for the deeper architecture of the self to emerge. It allows what you thought was your strength to break, so that you can discover the archetype beneath it, to the true inner pattern that has been guiding you long before you had words for your suffering. Your pain did not expect this moment, because your pain is rooted in an older version of you, a self that once believed it had to endure everything, hold everything, make sense of everything. Pain cannot imagine transformation, for pain sees only itself, repeating its own history, like a dream that refuses to end. But you are entering a stage in your psychological evolution where the unconscious begins to intervene, where the patterns you inherited from childhood, from your ancestral line, and even from the deeper collective field start to disintegrate. When this happens, the empath experiences something that feels like divine disorientation, an unsettling mixture of exhaustion, clarity, fear, and a strange sense of inner inevitability. You might say, I don't recognize who I'm becoming, and this is precisely the point, for the empath's comeback does not arise from reclaiming who they were, but from allowing who they were to dissolve. Let me speak to you as if we are sitting across from each other in a dimly lit room, surrounded by the quiet hum of the psyche at work. Perhaps there is a soft lamp in the corner, perhaps a faint aroma of old books. This is how I would speak to a patient standing on the edge of transformation, someone whose pain has finally exhausted its ability to imprison the soul. I would say, listen closely to the part of you that is tired, for tiredness is the psyche's way of refusing the unacceptable. I would tell you that the empath's exhaustion is not weakness, it is metamorphosis. When the butterfly can no longer remain in the chrysalis breaks. It is not a failure, it is the design. You have carried burdens that were never meant to be yours. You have internalized emotions that did not originate from your own story. You have become a vessel for the unspoken wounds of others, a mirror in which others see themselves more clearly than you see yourself. And yet, something is shifting in you. Perhaps you have begun to sense an inner boundary forming where there used to be none. Perhaps you feel a faint anger rising, not the destructive anger of resentment, but the sacred anger of reclamation, the kind that signals the self preparing to take the throne back from the ego that tried so hard to survive. This anger is not a sign that you are losing yourself. It is a sign that you are finally returning. People often misunderstand the empath. They imagine that sensitivity is a kind of fragility, a softness that must be protected from the harshness of life. But I have said many times, what you call vulnerability is where your true strength resides. The empath psyche is built with channels that run deeper than those of the ordinary mind. You have access to the subtle currents of emotion, intuition, instinct, and symbolic perception. Your attunement to the inner world is not an accident, it is an archetypal inheritance. Somewhere behind your personal story stands the figure of the wounded healer, an ancient pattern that has walked through history, myth, religion, and the collective unconscious from the beginning of time. When an empath is pushed too far, they do not simply break, they descend, they fall inward, down into the darkest caverns of their own psyche. They touch the raw essence of their unlived life. They confront the shadow. They meet the pain that has been waiting for decades to be acknowledged. And in this confrontation, something extraordinary happens. The ego loses its false sense of control, and the deeper self begins to awaken. This awakening may not feel beautiful at first. It may feel like chaos, shaking, instability, and even despair. But these sensations are birth pangs, not death throes. You are rising into a comeback, your pain never expected, because the comeback is not emerging from the part of you that suffered. It is emerging from the part of you that survived the suffering. The difference is immense. Pain fragments the ego, but survival strengthens the self. There is an ancient alchemy in this process. The empath's most wounded moments become the source of their most profound power. Not power over others, but power over their own inner life. The ability to witness, to endure, to understand, to metabolize the unconscious without collapsing into it. Consider the dream of a patient I once worked with. She dreamed she was carrying a heavy, ancient jar through a forest. The jar was cracked, leaking water with each step. She felt desperate, ashamed, terrified of losing its contents. Yet she continued to hold it tightly. Finally, in exhaustion, she dropped it, the jar shattered, and from the broken pieces emerged a glowing figure, a being of light that rose from the spilled water and walked ahead of her into the forest. When she awoke, she understood the jar was not meant to be preserved. It was meant to break. The water was not meant to be contained. It was meant to flow. The luminous figure was the part of her that could only be revealed when the burden was released. You, too, have been carrying a jar. You have been trying to hold together a life, an identity, a narrative that could no longer sustain your growth. The empath often believes their purpose is to preserve things, to protect relationships, maintain harmony, absorb emotional shock. But the true calling of the empath is not preservation, it is transformation. You are not here to keep the old story intact. You are here to let it break open so that the deeper self can emerge. If I speak to you about archetypes, it is because the archetype knows you better than you know yourself. The empath often lives under the influence of the mother archetype, not a literal mother, but the inner mother who nurtures, sacrifices, empathizes, and feels responsible for the emotional atmosphere around them. When this archetype becomes distorted, the empath becomes overburdened, enmeshed, self-effacing. They become a caretaker of the world's wounds. But when the archetype transforms, when the empath steps into the mature expression of the inner mother, they learn to nurture without losing themselves, to love without self-erasure, to feel without drowning. There's also the shadow, the part of the psyche that contains everything you reject about yourself. For the empath, the shadow often contains anger, boundaries, self-respect, intuition, and power qualities you have been taught to suppress in order to be good, kind, liked, or needed. But the shadow is rising now, not to destroy you, but to restore you. When the shadow integrates, the empath becomes whole. They stop giving away what they need to keep. They stop apologizing for emotions that are signals, not sins. They stop mistaking self-sacrifice for virtue. They begin to embody the full spectrum of their psychological energy, sensitivity, and strength, compassion, and clarity, softness and fire. This is why your comeback is inevitable. It is not based on motivation or willpower or external change. It is rooted in archetypal necessity. When the psyche reaches a saturation point, it demands renewal. The empath, who has spent years absorbing emotions as if they were a second skin, eventually reaches a threshold where the unconscious declares enough. And that moment, though painful, is sacred. It marks the turning of the inner tide. I want you to recognize the signs. Perhaps your patience is thinning. Perhaps you feel yourself withdrawing from people who once consumed your energy. Perhaps your intuition is louder, sharper, more insistent. Perhaps you sense an inner clarity cutting through the fog of years. These are not coincidences. These are signals that the deeper self is stepping forward, reclaiming territory that the world once occupied. In many myths, the hero descends into the underworld, not to be punished, but to retrieve something lost: wisdom, identity, power, the soul itself. The empath's journey follows the same pattern. You have descended. Yes, you have confronted darkness. You have felt the weight of emotions that did not belong to you. But you did not lose yourself there. You found a hidden thread, a faint but unbreakable line connecting you to a deeper presence within you. That presence is awakening now, pulling you upward, preparing you for the return. Your pain never expected this comeback, because pain is only one chapter of your psychological story, not the conclusion. The self, the central archetype, the organizing principle of your entire psyche, has been waiting patiently for the right moment to make itself known. And that moment is approaching. You feel it, don't you? Not as excitement, but as a quiet, grounded inevitability, a sense that the worst has already happened. and what comes next cannot harm you in the same way. You have outgrown the emotional cage that once held you. What rises in you now is not the empath who survived, but the empath who is ready to live. You may not realize it yet, but there is a distinct moment in an empath's life when the old psychic contract dissolves. It does not happen suddenly. Though it may feel abrupt, it is more like the slow weakening of a rope that has carried too much weight for too long, until one day, with absolute inevitability, it snaps, not out of failure, but out of necessity. When that rope snaps, you may interpret it as collapse, burnout, numbness, or detachment, but from the perspective of the unconscious, it is liberation. The psyche has decided that the old pattern of absorbing everything is no longer compatible with your growth. There is a transformation unfolding beneath the threshold of your awareness. You are not merely recovering, you are being restructured from within. Your instincts are sharpening, your intuition is reorganizing itself, your emotional body is shedding residues it has carried for years, and your dreams, yes, your dreams are becoming the secret language through which the unconscious prepares you for your rise. I have always believed that the dream is the royal road to the unconscious. The empath, in particular, dreams in symbols richer than most. You may dream of water overflowing or of floods washing through cities. This indicates that the emotional body is purging excess feelings, releasing affect that has been trapped in the depths of the psyche. You may dream of broken houses or rooms being renovated. This symbol reveals the restructuring of the inner architecture, the rebuilding of the ego container so that it can hold your emerging power. You may dream of lost objects suddenly found, or of ancient keys, or of doors long closed now swinging open. These are archetypal signs that something within you is being restored, an aspect of the self that had been buried under years of emotional duty. Another patient once told me a dream in which she stood in a graveyard where the soil began to crack. From beneath the earth, flowers pushed upward, blooming violently, breaking apart the ground with their force. She was terrified, believing she was witnessing the dead rising. But as we explored the dream together, she realized the flowers were her own vitality, her own psychic energy. Returning from a long hibernation, what she thought was resurrection of the past was in fact the return of her future. Something in her was rising from the psychological grave she had dug for herself through years of self-denial. Your psyche, too, is preparing for such a blooming. When the empath begins to rise, the world may misinterpret it. Those who once benefited from your softness may perceive your clarity as coldness. Those who once relied on your emotional labor may call your boundaries selfish. Those who once counted on your silence may fear your voice. But this fear is not your burden to carry. It belongs to those who depended on your smallness to maintain their comfort. Let me tell you something essential. Your transformation will disrupt certain relationships. It must, Psychological growth is not gentle. It is seismic. When the deeper self moves, the structures built upon your old identity cannot remain intact. They shift, they crumble, or they evolve depending on whether they can withstand the weight of your truth. This does not mean you have failed anyone. It means you are finally refusing to fail yourself. As you rise, you will notice a curious phenomenon. The more you reclaim your inner life, the less interested you are in carrying the emotional debris of others. What used to trigger you now feels distant. What used to drain you now feels irrelevant. What used to pull you into cycles of self-doubt now strikes you as transparent. This clarity is not cynicism, it is sovereignty. The empath's comeback is not a return to the past, it is an emergence into psychological adulthood. For the first time, you begin to see the world not through the lens of your wounds, but through the eyes of your archetypal potential. It is as if the soul, once dimmed by years of caretaking, begins to shine from behind the ego. You become less reactive and more discerning, less porous and more intentional, less compliant and more authentically present. This transformation may feel uncomfortable at first. You may feel guilt for no longer prioritizing other people's needs, guilt for choosing your own peace, guilt for saying no. But guilt is merely the echo of an outdated identity. It is the psychic residue of a role you no longer inhabit. When you feel guilt for protecting your energy, recognize it as a sign that you are stepping out of the archetype of the self-sacrificing caretaker and into the archetype of the sovereign empath. The sovereign empath is a powerful psychological figure. They are not overwhelmed by their sensitivity, but guided by it. They do not drown in emotion, but navigate it with instinctive grace. They do not give indiscriminately, but choose with precision. They do not abandon themselves in the name of compassion. Their compassion includes themselves. This archetype has been awakening in you slowly, but now it is accelerating. The psyche accelerates when it senses readiness. It dismantles the false self when the true self is strong enough to emerge. It pushes you out of old patterns when your soul becomes too large to fit inside them. If you feel restless, it is because your spirit is expanding. If you feel agitated, it is because your unconscious is clearing space. If you feel strangely honest, even blunt, it is because the mask is dissolving. If you feel yourself pulling away from what once defined you, it is because your identity is reforming. Your pain never expected this, because pain is linear. It sees the world through the narrow lens of cause and effect. But the psyche is circular. It returns to the same wound again and again until you no longer fear it, until you no longer identify with it, until you can hold it without collapsing. When that moment arrives, the wound ceases to be a wound. It becomes a portal. Let me speak to you about this portal, for it is central to your comeback. There is a moment in deep emotional suffering when the ego breaks open. This breaking open is terrifying because it dissolves the familiar boundaries of who you believe yourself to be. But this dissolution is necessary for the emergence of the self. The ego is like a shell, useful in the beginning, but suffocating if it remains closed forever. The empath's ego often cracks not because they are fragile, but because they are growing, and when the shell cracks, light enters. You begin to perceive things you could not perceive before. You begin to understand dynamics you once overlooked. You begin to sense the difference between intuition and projection, empathy and enmeshment, compassion and self-erasure. This clarity marks the beginning of psychological autonomy. Autonomy does not mean isolation. It means inner freedom, the ability to engage with the world without losing yourself in it. It is the capacity to feel deeply without being consumed by what you feel. It is the strength to say, this is mine, and this is not mine, with equal certainty. The empath has always been gifted with perception, but until now, that perception has been skewed by the fear of causing harm, the fear of conflict, and the fear of being misunderstood. These fears are dissolving. The deeper self does not fear conflict, for conflict is simply energy seeking balance. The deeper self does not fear being misunderstood, for misunderstanding says more about the other than about you. The deeper self does not fear change, for change is its very nature. Let me give you another image, a symbolic one. Imagine a river clogged with debris, branches, leaves, stones, fragments of things long forgotten. This river represents your emotional life. For years, it has been flowing with difficulty, slowed by responsibilities that were never yours, memories that were never resolved, emotions that were never expressed. Now imagine that the river begins to deepen, widen, and gain strength. As it does, the debris that once seemed immovable is naturally swept away, not through force, but through overflow. This is what is happening inside you. The empath's comeback does not begin with effort. It begins with overflow. Your soul is becoming too spacious, too alive, too conscious to remain confined in the stagnation that once defined you. This expansion is not something you must force. It is something you must allow. You are not rising because life is becoming easier. You are rising because you are becoming larger. This distinction is crucial. Adversity is not the opposite of transformation. It is its catalyst. The empath learns this late, often after years of believing that suffering is a sign of failure. But suffering is simply the psyche's way of signaling that the old self is dying and the new self is waiting to be born. You are in the middle of this birth process, and the contractions of the psyche are pushing you toward a new identity, one rooted not in survival, but in individuation. Individuation is the central aim of life. It is the process of becoming who you truly are beneath all conditioning, all wounds, all inherited patterns. And the empath, contrary to what many believe, is especially called to individuate because your sensitivity gives you access to the unconscious in ways others may never experience. You are not merely rising out of your pain, you are rising into your archetypal destiny. And destiny, my friend, always arrives on time. You may feel at this stage of your inner transformation that there's something indescribable stirring beneath your emotional landscape, something ancient, something sacred, something that feels as though it has been dormant for lifetimes. This sensation is not a delusion, nor is it wishful thinking. It is the psyche reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity. The empath, who once navigated life through the lens of other people's emotions, begins at last to orient themselves around their own inner truth. This reorientation feels strange, almost foreign, because you have lived for so long in states of attunement, absorption, and vigilance. You have been conditioned to feel before you think, to sense before you speak, to detect subtle emotional shifts as a matter of survival, but as the unconscious reclaims its rightful territory within you. These adaptive patterns begin to loosen. The survival strategies of the past no longer define your identity. Your sensitivity remains, yes, but it becomes refined, sharper, more discriminating, less entangled in the psychic noise of others. You begin to understand that your empathy was never meant to be a burden. It was meant to be a compass. When you were younger, your sensitivity placed you in situations where the emotional weight of others fell upon you like cold shadows. You may have absorbed the unmetabolized rage of a parent, the insecurity of a partner, the fears of a friend, or the collective anxiety of the environments you inhabited. You learned to carry what others could not face in themselves. This gave you a profound capacity for understanding, but it also robbed you of the clarity to see where their stories ended and yours began. Now, as your inner tide turns, that distinction becomes unmistakably clear. You begin to sense the contours of your own energy. You begin to feel where your aura ends and where another person's influence begins. You begin to walk through rooms, not as an open receptor, but as a conscious presence. This shift is not arrogant. It is necessary. The empath who remains porous forever is the empath who never fully incarnates into their own life. And you are finally incarnating fully, deeply, unapologetically. Let me tell you what happens psychologically. When an empath begins to rise, the archetype of the self begins to overshadow the archetype of the wounded child. For years, the wounded child within you was active, trying to earn love, avoid rejection, keep peace, and stay safe. The wounded child believes that the only way to survive is to be good, accommodating, perceptive, and emotionally obedient. But as the deeper self emerges, it begins to challenge this pattern. The self does not seek love, it radiates it. The self does not fear abandonment, it stands rooted in its own source. The self does not negotiate with chaos, it transcends it. This is the comeback. Your pain never expected the moment your psychic center shifts from survival to sovereignty. You may notice something else as well. The body begins to speak. The body is the oldest instrument of truth. It holds memories the mind has long forgotten. It carries tensions from battles you fought silently. It stores traumas you absorbed without consent. As you rise, the body begins to release these imprints. You may feel sudden fatigue, trembling, heat, cold, or bursts of emotion without obvious triggers. These sensations are not setbacks, they are purifications. The nervous system is recalibrating, the emotional body is unclenching, the psyche is clearing space for the self to take residence. Do not fear these somatic waves. They are part of your psychological rebirth. Another thing begins to happen. Synchronicities return. I have spoken often of synchronicities, those meaningful coincidences that reveal the invisible dialogue between the conscious mind and the unconscious world. When an empath is lost in self-sacrifice, synchronicities diminish, as though the psyche withdraws its guidance to encourage the ego to confront its own patterns. But when you begin to rise, synchronicities multiply. You notice signs, symbols, numbers, dreams that speak to you in metaphors. You hear your intuition echoing through moments that feel orchestrated by something greater than logic. This is not fantasy. It is the unconscious communicating with you directly, acknowledging that you are finally listening. You are re-entering alignment with your inner myth. Every individual carries an inner myth, a personal mythology that shapes the trajectory of their psychological development. Most people never discover theirs because they remain trapped in borrowed identities, cultural expectations, and inherited fears. But the empath, once awakened, inevitably returns to their myth, because sensitivity is the key that unlocks the symbolic language of the soul. You begin to recall forgotten passions, forgotten visions, forgotten aspects of yourself that were buried under years of emotional labor. These forgotten parts return with purpose. They are not fragments, they are roots. You may notice that your solitude feels different now. It no longer feels like escape or withdrawal. It feels like nourishment. It feels like returning home to yourself. The empath solitude is sacred, for it is in solitude that you hear the voice of your own soul without interference. You begin to crave moments of inner quiet, not because the world overwhelms you as it once did, but because you are learning to savor the presence of your own psyche. In this new state, you also begin to perceive the shadow differently. Instead of fearing it, you begin to recognize its necessity. The shadow contains everything you suppressed in order to be loved, your boundaries, your intuition, your anger, your desire, your authority, your authenticity. As these qualities rise from the unconscious, they may feel aggressive at first, like a lion roaring after decades of being caged. But this roar is liberation. It is the sound of your psychological sovereignty reclaiming itself. When an empath integrates their shadow, they become unrecognizable not to themselves, but to those who only knew their compliant version. You become clearer, sharper, more discerning. You stop tolerating what insults your soul, you walk away without theatrics from situations that once held you hostage. This ability to walk away is not coldness, it is consciousness. The empath who walks away is the empath who has awakened. People may say, "You have changed." They may accuse you of becoming distant, harder, less available. But the truth is that you are becoming more available to the only relationship you were missing before, the relationship with yourself. Let me give you another dream symbol, one that often appears during the empath's rise. A woman once told me she dreamed of a snake shedding its skin. The snake was not frightening, it was luminous, coiled in golden light. As it shed layer after layer, its colors grew brighter. When I asked her how she felt in the dream, she said, "It felt like watching truth reveal itself." This is the essence of your rise. You are shedding an identity that was too small for your soul. You are shedding beliefs that were never truly yours. You are shedding attachments that were built on trauma, not love. You are shedding roles that kept you in cycles of emotional servitude. You are shedding the illusion that your worth depends on how much pain you can carry. As these layers fall away, you begin to see yourself clearly for the first time, not as the empath who suffers, but as the empath who sees, the empath who knows, the empath who feels truth, not because they absorb the world, but because they understand the world from the depths of their own psyche. You begin to understand that your sensitivity was not designed for survival, it was designed for insight. This shift marks the beginning of your psychological comeback. You start to recognize patterns before they unfold. You begin to sense manipulation before it reaches your door. You notice the energetic quality of people, places, and situations with razor-sharp clarity. You no longer confuse compassion with compliance. You no longer tolerate emotional chaos as if it were normal. You no longer allow your boundaries to be negotiated. Your clarity becomes your protection. Your discernment becomes your compass. Your presence becomes your power. From here, life begins to reorganize itself around your new center. Opportunities appear that resonate with your deeper truth. Relationships shift, revealing who can meet you at your new level of consciousness. You stop chasing, proving, explaining. You simply become, and your becoming is magnetic. As you rise, a new kind of strength emerges, one that is quiet, grounded, and profoundly unshakable. This strength does not roar, it hums, it radiates, it anchors. It is the strength of someone who has walked through the underworld of their own psyche and returned with eyes that can see in the dark. This is the empath's true power, not the ability to feel others, but the ability to feel themselves fully. As this power awakens, you begin to realize something extraordinary. You are no longer living inside your pain. Your pain is living inside your transformation. It becomes a thread in the larger tapestry of your individuation, a symbol rather than a prison, a teacher rather than a tyrant. And this realization, my friend, is the threshold the threshold of your comeback, the threshold of your emergence, the threshold of the life you were always meant to inhabit. There comes a moment, quiet, subtle, almost imperceptible, when the empath realizes that the world no longer feels as heavy as it once did. It is not because the world has changed, it is because you have the psychological infrastructure within you has been reformed, strengthened, and illuminated from the inside. What once overwhelmed you now passes through you like wind through an open window. What once destabilized you now reveals itself as merely a story, a projection, a symbol in the great drama of your inner life. This is the moment where everything shifts. For years, perhaps decades, you believed that your empathy made you vulnerable. You believed that your emotional openness was a liability, that your ability to sense the subtle currents in others placed you at a disadvantage. And yes, before your psychological maturation, it did. Unintegrated empathy is a wound. It is a fracture in the boundary between self and other. It leaves you open to invasion, fusion, and psychic exhaustion. But integrated empathy is the opposite. It is a force, a weapon, a gift of perception that few possess. It is the ability to see beneath masks, beneath words, beneath actions, and into the truth behind them. It is the capacity to discern what others hide from themselves. It is the power to perceive the symbolic dimension of reality, the mythic layer beneath events, the archetypal patterns playing out through the people around you. And now, as you rise, it is becoming undeniably active. The unconscious has been preparing you for this expansion for far longer than you realize. Every heartbreak, every disillusionment, every betrayal, every period of numbness, every collapse of meaning, these were not random assaults on your spirit. They were initiations. They were symbolic deaths that stripped away the illusions that kept you bound to the roles that minimized you. The empath often undergoes a series of emotional deaths before they awaken. These deaths are not literal. They are psychological dissolutions. The death of naivety, the death of self-sacrifice, the death of the belief that you must be small in order to be loved. Each of these deaths brings you closer to the truth of your inner nature. And the truth is this: you were never meant to be merely sensitive. You were meant to be perceptive. You were never meant to be a rescuer. You were meant to be sovereign. You were never meant to absorb the world. You were meant to read it. This is the empath's destiny, not to carry the wounds of others, but to understand the archetypal patterns behind them, not to drown in emotional turmoil, but to navigate the symbolic ocean of the collective unconscious with clarity. Let me speak to you now of the shadow for the final time, because your relationship with it determines the outcome of your comeback. The shadow is not darkness. It is the unlit chamber of your psyche where your power waits. The empath who fears their shadow becomes prey to the forces of the world, but the empath who embraces their shadow becomes the embodiment of psychological wholeness. As your shadow integrates, you begin to reclaim qualities you once rejected in yourself: courage, clarity, assertiveness, self-protection, instinct, intuition, fire. These qualities were never your enemies. They were suppressed aspects of your individuality waiting for permission to return. And now, in this rising, you are granting them that permission. This integration creates something rare: an empath with boundaries, an empath with discernment, an empath with an unshakable core. Such a person is not easily manipulated, not easily deceived, not easily drained. You become like a lighthouse, sensitive to the storms of the sea, yet anchored in rock. Your empathy continues to perceive the world with precision, but you no longer absorb its chaos. You stand within your own center, and from that center you rise. Now, let us speak of archetypes, for the end of your journey is always the beginning of a new relationship with the archetypal world. The self, as I have said, is the central archetype, the organizing principle of your entire psyche. When the empath finally rises into the self, they undergo a profound shift in consciousness. Life is no longer a series of emotional reactions. It becomes a symbolic landscape. Every encounter reveals meaning. Every challenge reveals a hidden story. Every emotion becomes a messenger rather than an enemy. This is the empath's true awakening. You begin to understand that life is not happening to you. Life is happening for your inner development. You stop asking, why did this happen to me? And begin asking, what is the unconscious trying to show me? This shift marks the difference between living as a victim of fate and living as a participant in your own individuation. When the empath reaches this stage, they undergo a transformation that shocks even themselves. They become less reactive, more reflective. They do not rush to soothe the discomfort of others. They allow people to face their own shadows without intervening. They recognize that true compassion is not rescuing, it is witnessing. True empathy is not absorbing, it is understanding. And true love is not sacrificing the self, it is becoming the self so fully that your presence alone becomes a source of healing. This is the comeback your pain could not imagine, because pain can only imagine more pain, but the soul imagines something greater. It imagines expansion, revelation, transcendence. Let me give you one final dream symbol to close this journey. A man once told me that he dreamed of standing before a mountain. At first, he believed the mountain was a barrier, an obstacle preventing him from moving forward. But as he walked closer, he saw that the mountain was not solid rock. It was a vast mirror. And in that mirror, he saw not his face, but the figure behind him, tall, grounded, luminous, unscient. It was his self. He awoke with tears in his eyes, realizing that the greatest obstacle was merely a reflection of the greatness waiting to emerge within him. This dream belongs to you as well. The mountain you feared was your own potential. The barrier you imagined was your own untapped depth. The reflection you avoided was your own unconscious calling you home. You are rising now, not into a version of yourself that the world once demanded, but into the version of yourself that your soul has been shaping since the moment you were born. The empath who rises is not the empath who returns to what they once were. The empath who rises is the empath who becomes who they were always meant to be. You are stepping out of your pain. You are stepping out of your past. You are stepping out of your old identity, and you are stepping into yourself. The world has not yet seen who you are becoming. Your pain has not yet understood what it has created. Your unconscious has been preparing you for this moment quietly, faithfully, relentlessly. And now the moment arrives. Rise not as the empath who suffers, but as the empath who sees, not as the empath who absorbs, but as the empath who knows, not as the empath who breaks, but as the empath who returns transformed. Your comeback begins here. Your psyche is ready. Your soul is ready, and your life finally is ready to receive the person you have become. You are rising into a comeback your pain never expected, because it is a comeback built not from your wounds, but from your awakening